In a remote countryside of Ireland, archaeologists uncovered hundreds of ancient graves. But among the countless skeletal remains, there were 3 bodies that left the entire team in stunned silence. One had been bent unnaturally, its body twisted in a bizarre and disturbing way. The other 2 had large stones forcibly inserted into their mouths, as if someone had tried to seal them, to keep something locked inside. Who were they? And why would their deaths terrify someone enough to bind their corpses, as though warding off a curse? In today's video, we'll be exploring one of the deepest fears that haunted Europe for more than 1,000 years, the fear of the dead coming back to life. So fasten your seatbelt as we dive into today's mystery. But first, you'll have incredible luck if you like and subscribe before this video ends. Tucked between the limestone mountain ranges and glacial lakes of Western Ireland lies a little-known place called Kiltisheen. For centuries, this land has been the setting of old tales. Stories of fairies, restless spirits, and ancient magic whispered beside campfires across generations. In 2004, a team of archaeologists arrived here, hoping to uncover the remains of a medieval bishop's palace. They expected to find broken masonry, religious relics, or perhaps the crumbling remains of defensive walls. But what they discovered was unlike anything science had previously accounted for. The archaeologists began carefully removing each heavy slab of stone, and as each one was lifted, something shocking began to appear. Real human skulls, crushed beneath the very foundations of the structure, as if the builders had deliberately constructed it over the remains of the dead. Within a space barely 3 square meters wide, they uncovered between 30 and 40 skeletons, stacked one atop another in a chaotic and chilling arrangement. When they expanded the excavation into the nearby field, more graves began to surface. The archaeologists estimated that the number of burials was so vast, nearly 3,000 individuals may have been interred here. But among these thousands of skeletal remains, a few stood out as being disturbingly different. One skeleton had been forcibly bent, its body deformed beneath massive stones placed directly on top of it. 2 others had large, heavy rocks jammed deep inside their mouths. These findings were not only archaeologically jarring, but they also posed a question that could not be easily dismissed. Were these individuals once considered a threat, even after death? One male skeleton, estimated to be in his 30s, was discovered in a state of extreme disfigurement. Unlike the majority of traditional burials, his legs were not laid straight beneath him. Instead, they had been twisted upward toward his torso, as if someone had used their full strength to fold his body in half. More disturbingly, his spine and pelvis showed signs of deliberate trauma, broken, then bound in a position that defied any natural posture. A large stone had been wedged into the center of the skeleton, as if to pin it down, to stop something from breaking free. For people like Professor Mark Horton, an archaeologist who had excavated hundreds of medieval graves, this discovery went far beyond anything he had ever encountered. In an interview, he didn't try to hide his astonishment. "This body was shattered, then tied together like a bundle of flesh and bone," he said. "It's possible they did this to make absolutely sure that this man could never come back from the dead." But things didn't end there. When the team uncovered the next skeleton, a quiet hush fell over the entire site. Lodged between the teeth of the deceased was a large, heavy stone. The surrounding teeth had all been broken. This wasn't an object that had simply fallen into the mouth over time. It had been forced in, deliberately, with violent intent. And this unsettling detail suggested a disturbing possibility: that someone had performed a ritual on this body just before it was buried beneath the earth. From that moment on, a troubling question began to take shape. Had the people of Kiltisheen, more than 1,000 years ago, believed that some of the dead would not stay buried? After bringing the unusual skeletal remains back to the lab for detailed analysis, what the archaeologists uncovered not only confirmed their initial suspicions, it opened a doorway straight into the darkest corners of the medieval human psyche. As the bones were carefully cleaned, marks hidden beneath layers of earth began to reveal themselves. On the legs and ribs of several individuals, researchers identified deep, clean cuts, as though someone had struck through their bodies with a sword or spear in a deliberate, calculated motion. What stood out was that these wounds were not caused by accidents or injuries sustained in battle. They were signs of mutilation inflicted after death. But why would anyone do this to the dead? One theory suggests that these individuals were not merely victims of war or casualties of social exclusion. They were buried in ways that made it clear someone had gone to great lengths to ensure they could not rise again from beneath the soil. And this wasn't unique to Ireland. Across the distant regions of the Czech Republic, England, and Romania, archaeologists have uncovered similarly strange graves. In some, bodies had been nailed into their coffins. Others had been decapitated and buried face down. Some were found with iron stakes driven through their hearts or with heavy stones pressed against their chests, as if to pin them in place. Archaeologists refer to these as deviant burials, burials that deviate from the standard rites of Christian doctrine, which dictated that the dead be laid straight with their heads facing west, awaiting the day of resurrection. One researcher explained it this way: when the living feared what the dead might do after death, they didn't act out of hatred, they acted out of defense. And in a time when the boundary between life and death was never absolute, that defense could become a communal ritual. As the strange skeletal remains at Kiltishin began to reveal their first clues, archaeologists and historians noticed something familiar: signs that pointed directly to medieval manuscripts and chronicles. These were sources where tales of the dead returning to life, known as revenants, did not merely survive as fragments of folklore. They were recorded with a level of detail and seriousness typically reserved for official history. In the English village of Stappenhill, a chilling story was documented in the year 1085, one that would continue to send shivers down the spines of readers for centuries. Two farmers had recently moved to a settlement near Burton Abbey. One evening, they both died suddenly during dinner. Their burials were conducted according to standard Christian rites, but just a few nights later, the villagers began seeing them again. Sometimes the two men reappeared as shadowy figures carrying coffins upon their backs. Other times, they took on the form of vague, unrecognizable animals. But the most terrifying detail was this: anyone whose name was spoken by the revenants in the dead of night would soon fall ill and die not long afterward. What had once been a quiet rural village had now become a haunted place. Panic spread. Families fled their homes. Fear infected the air like a plague. And finally, an extraordinary decree was issued not by a fearful mob, but by the church itself. The two corpses were to be exhumed, decapitated, disemboweled, and their hearts burned. This was more than a ritual. It was an execution, carried out after death. A sentence passed down upon two bodies the community believed had committed crimes from beyond the grave. So when exactly did these graves originate? Because if a precise date could be determined, it might not only reveal the origins of these bizarre rituals, it could also pinpoint the moment when a deep-seated fear first began to take root. Scientists quickly turned to radiocarbon isotope analysis. After 2 long weeks of waiting, the results finally arrived. The report confirmed that the skeletons buried with stones in their mouths, those laid to rest in such strange and troubling ways, had been underground since approximately 720 to 760 AD. And that was a discovery that could not be taken lightly. Because if this was accurate, it meant these acts of post-mortem restraint had taken place at least 3 centuries before the first written accounts of revenants in England, and nearly 1,000 years before vampire folklore would explode across Eastern Europe. In an ancient Irish text known as the First Synod of St. Patrick, a religious legal code written sometime in the 7th or 8th century, there is a passage that explicitly condemns those who believe in spirits returning from the dead. The existence of that law reveals something simple and chilling. The belief in vampires, or entities like them, had already spread widely enough that the church felt compelled to speak out. In a small village called Marotinu de Sus in southern Romania, a man named Petre Toma passed away in 2004. His family held a proper funeral, burying him according to Orthodox Christian rites. At first glance, everything appeared completely normal. But less than 6 weeks later, his granddaughter began telling a different story. She claimed her grandfather had been appearing to her in dreams, night after night, and not as the gentle, kind-eyed man she remembered, but as a gaunt, hollow-eyed figure, silently standing outside her bedroom window. Stories like these were not uncommon in her village. Everyone knew the name for such occurrences: Moroi, the restless dead who brought unease to the living. And so, on a night in March, 6 men quietly walked to the cemetery, shovels in hand. They unearthed the grave of Petra Toma. They opened the coffin, split open his chest, and removed his heart. Then they carried it out to a barren field where they burned it to ash. Afterwards, they mixed the ashes into water and gave it to the granddaughter to drink. When the story reached the press, the reaction across Romania was one of shock. In the cities, many expressed embarrassment that such medieval brutality could still exist in the modern age. But in the village where it had happened, no one seemed ashamed. The locals didn't see it as an inhumane act. Quite the opposite. They believed they had done something good for the one who had passed on. That truth raises a deeper question, one no chemical test could ever truly answer. Could it be that these so-called superstitious medieval rituals were, in fact, a deeply rooted cultural reflex? Or perhaps a way for human communities to maintain balance between the living and the dead? When the stones once buried deep inside the mouths of the dead at Kiltasheen were brought back to the lab, when shattered bones were pieced back together like questions with no answers, and when the fingerprints of human hands still lingered on skeletal remains more than 1,000 years old, one thing slowly became clear. We are not merely looking into the past. We are listening to echoes that still call out from the present. From the medieval rituals of restraining the dead to the 1968 exhumation led by historian Chauncey Loomis. From tales of walking corpses in Stappenhill to a heart burned in a Romanian village in the 21st century, all of it points to one undeniable truth. Across every age, human beings have struggled to make sense of what happens when life comes to an end. Modern science offers many explanations. That gas from decomposition can swell the body. That blood spilling from the mouth is simply gastric fluid. That fingernails appear to grow because the skin retracts. But in the 8th century, people didn't think that way. And so, beneath the damp, cold soil of Western Ireland, there remain bodies buried in ways no one dares repeat. There are mouths that still hold stones, and there are questions that, even after all these centuries, still have no clear answers. If this story made you pause and think or reminded you of something you once heard, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you'd like to keep exploring mysteries like this one, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. I'll see you in the next mysteries.